Hey, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Scaling Back for Successful Impact. It's the latest webinar produced by the AAMC. I'm Sandra Fraser, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. Through the Professional Development Committee at the Association of Art Museum Curators Foundation, we offer webinars on timely issues and topics of interest to art museum curators. They tend to be practical topics, the kind of thing that you're not going to learn in school. As well, we strive to represent a diversity of curators within our membership and beyond. For example, selecting panelists from large institutions and smaller organizations, curators working with specialized, historical, and contemporary arts, and organizations with diverse mandates. And it's often through these case studies that we as curators can learn from a wide variety of colleagues in our field. And today you have the opportunity to pose questions through this little doodad on the right hand of your computer screen. And we'll take some time before the end of the session to address as many of the questions as we can. So I want to say greetings from Ramey Modern in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. If you don't know where that is, we're north of Montana and North Dakota. And we're set to open a brand new museum in October this year. As a member of the AAMC Professional Development Committee, I was particularly interested in this topic of scaling back for successful impact. As I'm sure many of you have read about or even experienced yourselves, the period after a new museum or an expansion takes place is often fraught with a bit of contraction. And so I'm particularly keen to hear the insights of the panelists that we have with us today. And I can direct you to the website if you want some details about the biographies, but I will say we're joined by Rand Suffolk. He's the director of the High Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. Christine Creamer, who's the deputy director and chief curator at the National Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And Srimari Mitra, who's the director at the Stamps Gallery, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So let's face it, I don't think anyone scales back because it's their wish to scale back. It's a response to some kind of pressure that we're feeling. Maybe it's financial or staff cuts. Maybe it's burnout from one too many blockbuster exhibitions, or perhaps your metrics just aren't showing you the success that you're anticipating. And as one of the curators in your organization, you're probably not the one who's making the decision to scale back. So how then can you make the best of it? So that's a bit of the scope of the discussion, and of course we can make it broader depending on the questions and the conversation that ensues. So I thought we'd start with Srimari. I know you experienced quite a bit of contraction when you were a curator of contemporary art at the Art Gallery of Windsor across the river from Detroit. I'm hoping you can describe some of the cutbacks that you experienced and talk about how that impacted your curatorial work. What were your strategies there?
Thank you, Sandra, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm excited to hear as well as to participate. So yes, absolutely. When I worked at the Art Gallery of Windsor, which is at the southern tip of Canada, across the river from Detroit, we did undergo major cutbacks and scaling back, rather. But it's a process that had actually started well before my arrival, is what I learned after I arrived. So, for example, the two sort of key positions were left unfilled. One was the curator of the collection, as well as the manager of education. So I was the curator of contemporary art and the only curator in the entire public art gallery. Of course, the director, her expertise, so then she was also curating. Her expertise is in early, historical and modern Canadian art, and so she was, trying to, was working on some projects based on the collection. So when I arrived was July 2011, and by the end of 2012, things really came to a head. Just briefly describe the context before I can jump into the types of programs. And at that point, it really came to a point where, we were about to close. And of course, all of this played out very publicly. And finally, the board developed a partnership with the city of Windsor, who then purchased the museum, the entire building, and in that way took on the responsibilities for the facilities and maintenance of the building, which really was one of the major sort of ongoing expenses that had become unsustainable for the gallery to manage. And by doing that, what that meant was, at that point, we were about 18 people on staff. So we sort of dwindled down to 8.5 people. We had one educator. So the manager of education was never filled. And this was much before I had arrived. We had one full-time education coordinator, which then became a part-time role. We still did have the docents, of course, sort of a pool of strong docents who had been around. So having arrived at the end of 2011 and sort of going through all these cutbacks in my first year there, and really getting ready to launch a program from 2013, it required to really rethink what we're doing in a very deep way, and really begin the question of how can we develop a program that would be meaningful to the community. Not that that's not something we're thinking about all the time, but with so much uncertainty around the gallery, all of it had played out very publicly. So there was a lot of press, a lot of shock from the arts community in Canada, frankly, after the recession 2007 and 2008, with as things came to a head in Detroit, in Windsor as well, we were deeply impacted by it, and that's sort of part of the reasons of the scaling back. The immediate needs were to think about, for me, thinking about what are the needs in the institution. So definitely education and public programs was a huge hole that one really needed to think about how do we address this, and then within the community, right? What are the needs in the community, and how can the gallery still become, be an integral part of the community in Windsor and Southwestern Ontario, and then of course beyond, and our audiences across the river in Detroit. So for me, the strategy was really to think about exhibitions and programs that could address all of these. So one project that I launched at the beginning of 2013 was an exhibition called Border Cultures. So Border Cultures was a multi-year project. So Windsor being a border city, it is considered to be one of the largest border crossings between US and Canada. The border somehow, I recognized when I arrived there, how everybody enthusiastically shared their stories and anecdotes about the border or the traumas of crossing the border. But it wasn't reflected in any way in the culture of the city. And so the exhibition then, for me, I realized we need to do something that recognizes, that can address these sort of burgeoning ideas and emotions and histories that are so present in the region. So Border Cultures, it was a 3-part exhibition that took place over 3 years. The idea was that every year we looked at a different thematic related to the border. So in the first year, the theme was homes and land. The second year, the theme was work and labor. And then the third year was security and surveillance. And in that way, also addressing how tied our economies are really between Canada and US, and particularly Detroit and Windsor. And how, in some ways, the exhibition can also begin a conversation towards healing, and then also, so that was, with the thematic, of course, there were artists who were from Windsor, Detroit, and then national and international artists. But also specifically, I was very careful in always commissioning a community engaged project. So with every exhibition, there were public programs that were tied into the work of the exhibit, into the artwork, so to speak. So, not making a distinction between public programming and the art and the artworks specifically. So then the exhibition space itself became this really dynamic space where we had constantly through the shows, ongoing programs that were linked very directly to community organizations or different departments at the University of Windsor. Certainly the school, the art school was an important partner. The law school, actually, we did some very interesting partnerships with them. Tourism Windsor Essex, Pelee Island came on board as a partner where they would promote our programs across the region and across the border. And then, of course, Windsor Women working with immigrant women, Turtle Island Aboriginal Education Center. These were sort of some key partnerships that I was really interested in cultivating over a course of time. So rather than doing sort of one project and then for one partnership and then moving on to the next, the idea was really to sort of slow it down a little bit and really, kind of refocus on the programs and to see how we can continue by building these deep partnerships, how we can continue to build deep audiences. So that was kind of a overarching strategy that sort of became the through line for most of my exhibitions and programs during my time there.
Thanks so much. Now, Christine, in your situation, your museum, from what I understand, has been going through a more sustained period of shrinking budgets and with no real end in sight. And as the chief curator and the deputy director, you're actually able to be around the table helping to address some of those issues, and in ways that you're just implementing now at your museum. And I wonder if you could talk about your strategy for addressing the burnout that your staff and you yourself have been experiencing.
Yeah, thank you very much, and hi everybody. Honestly, the whole sort of issue of flat budget and flat staffing numbers is something that probably affects every museum, around the world. And so that's a reality we all deal with. When I look at the National Museum of African Art, I realized some years back that no matter what we did, whether it was a different director, a different approach, we still felt like we were frantic, and it did lead to burnout, like you could never get caught up. And that's a horrible feeling because we're all sort of type A personalities and we like to overachieve at the National Museum of African Art, and I'm sure at all your institutions as well. And so it became a question of where was the choke point? Where were the real challenges? And I realized that several directors back, we had initiated this sort of constantly changing gallery spaces in many of our galleries. And that was, sort of this constant production then schedule, which made it very hard. But when I finally began to think, well, what could we do differently? I took a look at our very large second level gallery where we typically had scheduled large changing shows that we either developed ourselves or took in from the outside. And I thought, now that's an area we could change. We could change it because it was using up all of our financial resources. We had to always hire from the outside to help us pull off these shows. So it was even more expensive than it needed to be. And then I began to think, importantly, as we just heard, about audience. And I realized, of course, that the Smithsonian, where most of our visitors are tourists, they're coming, they're learning about Africa and Africa's arts often for the first time. They're not tracking necessarily the blockbuster shows. And so I felt that maybe if we turned that second level gallery over to more of our permanent collection, we would achieve a number of things. One, we'd get more great works of art out there, which two, would appeal to our docents who give our volunteer docing corps, who give most of the tours, public tours at our museum. It would also appeal to school groups, so that they could build in consistency to coming to our museum for tours that were relating to their sort of standards of learning at different points in time in the school year. And then, once we got that permanent collection up in level 2, complementing in a different way permanent collection materials that are up on level 1, because we're an underground museum, so there's challenges there too. But at any rate, level 1 and level 2, then we began to have a bit of what I would call breathing room. And that's what our staff needed. So obviously, we have to have room for flexibility, room to grow, and room to incorporate change into our exhibition program. And so I began to look at some of the smaller spaces in our level 1 galleries to say, these could potentially be nice, tight, small spaces that allow curators the flexibility to grow, to pursue a particular idea, to keep current with the field, even to take in small traveling shows. And then we also share, for the big traveling shows or big exhibits that we create, a special gallery that wasn't available earlier in our history on the 3rd level. And we share that programmatically with the Sackler Gallery for Asian Art. And so we have to sort of fit it in. But by, like sometimes we have it, sometimes Sackler has it. But by building those kinds of things in, our museum could begin to see light at the end of the tunnel, importantly, and also that we had a strategy for what I would call a flexible, doable approach to change at our museum. And by that, I mean that this level 2 gallery we're calling Visionary is bringing in our so-called traditional and contemporary works of art together in thematic sort of galleries that are cross-cutting. So cross-cutting themes allows you a lot of programmatic potential and also a lot of flexibility in rotating objects in and out. And again, trying to key to our mission, which is an art museum, so engaged, focused, looking at great works of art and beginning to get our visitors sort of informed in some ways, not just about the themes, but engaged with the themes that we're so excited about at our museum. And so it was all of that sort of coming together at once that I think began to crystallize. And we're actually hoping to open our level 2 gallery in early to the public in early November of this year. So it's been a long time coming. We have 3 curators working on it, myself included, so it's been a group process. Our educators are contributing in terms of some fun, hands-on, and interactives and so on. It's not necessarily what I would call the cutting edge of museum practice, but we think we're building in a level of flexibility so that over time we can add. And then importantly, and in response to the public's sort of interest in our collection, we're getting more objects on view in these thematic galleries, including what we call dense display. I won't call it open storage because it's still a very artful approach to getting more on view, but it's allowing our visitors to see some of the wonderful works of African art that we have at this museum.
Thanks, Christine. That was really great. And Rand, at the High Museum, you've had great success since the museum expanded in 2005, and you're not facing a financial crisis that I'm aware of. And yet you've been leading some rethinking around the High's programming priorities. So I wonder if you could speak to some of the recent decisions around how your team is developing the exhibition program.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'm going to wave my hand, not to say hello, but to hopefully get my lights to come back on. Sorry, they went off. They're on a timer. I must have been listening too intently to my colleagues. The High, you mentioned our Renzo Piano expansion in 2005, and that really tripled the square footage of the museum. And since then time, right after that, I think it was very important, if you're thinking historically about the institution, we wanted to send a significant message about what our aspirations were, who we wanted to be when we grew up, and so forth. And a big part of that was embracing that blockbuster exhibition model. And once, twice, 3 times a year, that really was our primary focus. We built our entire business plan around those major exhibitions year in and year out. The problem with that ultimately is that at about the same time that the High was going down that path, I think the rest of the field realized that those shows are harrowing, right? You do them one time and it's fantastic, and then suddenly we got to do it again. We got to do it again. You put more and more resources into it, but over time, you're really not getting the benefits. And so when I came to the museum, we started taking a look at just really some basic trend analysis. I was in my first budget meeting at the museum, and my CFO said, you know, the thing about those numbers is that they really haven't changed since the expansion in 2005. And I thought, well, that's interesting. A little red flag went off. And so circled back to that, started asking more questions, drilling in a little more deeply. And I said, look, let's just do some basic trend analysis. Let's look at the 5 years before the Renzo Piano expansion in 2005 and compare them with the last 5 years. And I said, let's look at overall attendance. Well, overall attendance was slightly ahead in comparison to that time period. What about paid attendance? Paid attendance was actually down in comparison, and paid attendance had dropped 60% in the previous 5 years. Said, okay, well, that's not great, but we could rationalize part of that if what was happening for membership. Well, if membership was going up, right? Because your primary benefit is you get to come as often as you want. Well, membership, unfortunately, was also down in comparison, had dropped 33% during the preceding 5 years. So as a model, we were putting an awful lot of resources and energy and time and so forth into something that at the end of the day wasn't sustainable for us as an organization. So that's one piece of it. The second piece was we were just looking at the sheer number of exhibitions we were doing at the museum. And we were doing about 20 to 23 shows a year. And then the question was, if we drop that to 17 or 16 or 15, you know, is anyone really going to notice? You know, would our audience really know that we had scaled back in that way? And ultimately, we decided that they probably wouldn't. And then maybe this was an opportunity for us to go a little more deeply into certain other exhibitions. The other part of it was when we were on that blockbuster sort of cycle, I think we'd become a net importer of exhibitions. And I was really encouraged by the curator. We have a great curatorial team here, and I wanted them to take a greater level of responsibility in developing the intellectual capital of this organization. And so how could we not only scale back in terms of the numbers that we were doing, maybe not less money, but how would we redirect those dollars into projects that we were generating ourselves? And that was an important shift for us. So if you look at the model that we've embraced now, we've gone from about 23 shows a year, as I said, back in 2015. This year, we have 15 scheduled. We probably won't go below that. That'll fluctuate a little bit, up maybe 16 or 17 over the coming years. But right now, that seems to be a good comfort zone for us and is allowing us to, from a curatorial standpoint, as I said, identify some hopefully really wonderful projects that they'll be able to do on their own. The flip side of that, I will tell you, is it is also allowing us to spend more time on the care and feeding of our permanent collection. Those blockbusters that we had really grabbed the spotlight and pulled it away from our permanent collection. And after a lot of listening and learning that we did with our audience, one of the things that was clear to us was that the permanent collection had become sort of the redheaded stepchild, that really wasn't getting the attention that it needed. I'm sorry if there's any redheaded people out there. Anyways. But this model has allowed us to do, I think, place greater focus on the permanent collection than otherwise we would have.
But thank you, Rand. It's interesting that although it's a scarcity of resources that motivates scaling back, in most cases, one of the positive threads that I'm hearing from what each of you are saying is how providing time and space for curators to slow down, right? Get breathing room, dig deeper, build intellectual capital. That's all good news for curators, right? So it's gratifying to hear that there's a successful, even business model that's based on the care and feeding of good curatorial work. That is also meeting your visitor engagement needs, right? Because we can't lose sight of that aspect of our work. And I just feel so far this conversation is inspiring, and I feel gratified because I know a lot of us as curators feel that we're always running, right? We're run, and we have not enough time to research or reflect on our work. So I thought we could maybe go back around to each of you and maybe explore another aspect of your programming or curatorial strategies within this context. Christine, I thought I would start with you this time, and thinking about something you told me on the phone about some of the brand identity issues that your museum is facing with the new Museum of African American History and Culture opening. And I was interested in hearing about how you're seeing that sort of brand identity issue as a way that's actually helping you to define some clearer goals around your programming and the messaging around the programming that you're doing.
Right. Thank you for that question. Before I turn to that, I neglected to mention that one of the other strategies we had, in addition to getting more permanent collection out, was keeping our exhibitions open longer. Again, because our visitors are largely tourists, and so they're coming through, and it gives them ample opportunity, and they're not necessarily tracking the turnaround, as we've heard elsewhere. Now, if I turn to the question that you've just asked about branding and brand identity, true enough, we began as a private museum on Capitol Hill in 1964 during the Civil Rights Movement. The Museum of African Art was founded as a cross-cultural institution, to engage in cross-cultural communication, and a real focus on African and African-American arts. And so it was interesting that early on, our museum, before we became Smithsonian, collected African-American art and displayed it as well. And it was an important addition to the sort of cultural scene of the city. When we became part of the Smithsonian in 1979, as part of a larger institution, we began to sort of look at the collection and realize, you know, we really don't need to be, should not be in competition with other Smithsonian museums. And so the African American arts that we had in the collection were transferred by and large, though not entirely, over to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So they're still within the Smithsonian family. And so if you think about that history, then you realize that as early as 1964, we were seen as a center for those interested in Africa and Africa's arts and cultures, but also for those interested in African American history, culture, arts, and the connections. And so throughout our history, whether before we became Smithsonian or after, we've always tried to make connections with Africa and its diasporas. So fast forward to, you know, sort of past a few years, when finally, and we're delighted that the National Museum of African American History and Culture was in a public phase of fundraising, was beginning to ramp up. The building is built. It's now open, you know, for all to come on time tickets. So, you know, check it out in advance. But, you know, we realized from all of the calls that we were getting, public calls, that the public was conflating. They were conflating our mission, our museum, our focus on Africa with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And part of that can be just somewhat of a similarity in name, but also that often, very often, even people I know, my family members, they're like confused because they think we're part of the new museum. And so we realized, you know, we've got to sort of do some rebranding now. It's a good opportunity. Our previous director, she's now Director Emerita, Janet Betch-Cole, retired at the end of March. We are in the midst of a search and hoping to get a new director very soon. And so this is a great opportunity for us to look forward, to say, where are we going as a museum in the future? And with this new partner, this new sister organization, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, of course, we want to partner with that museum and, you know, begin to sort of reap the benefits of the many, many visitors who are going there. But it also allows our museum to rebrand and to begin to think, what is our brand now and into the future? And one of the things that I'm thinking about, and I think our board is, and I think members of staff are thinking, is really that global focus as an international art museum, and one where we are increasingly collecting and exhibiting contemporary African art. Our focus can now be much more global, and importantly, and this is sort of in some ways a different model of the way we've done business in the past anyway, being more of a facilitator of engagement versus the pressure of always having to create the exhibit, do the book, and do the programs here. There's nothing wrong with having a great exhibit here at the National Museum of African Art. But imagine, if you will, if we had the kind of presence on the African continent and we began to be able to link up, network, partner with artists, arts organizations, creative people on the continent and in its diasporas in Europe and elsewhere around the world, then all of a sudden, the National Museum of African Art becomes this global focus on the arts of Africa. And I suspect there will not be quite as much brand confusion. And so if we retool and look to the future, I think we've got great opportunities. As a final thought, I would say that my dreams and desires for this global connection have to also be embraced in some ways by the Smithsonian administration, in the sense that I think Smithsonian art museums are not always branded as part of the Smithsonian. So many people come for air and space and so on, and so they don't necessarily think of the Smithsonian, except for those of us in the arts, admittedly, for the general public, the Smithsonian as a place of the arts. And so it's a sort of a double win situation of rebranding for the institution that's much more inclusive about the arts and an art focus, but then also for our museum to have a more outward, engaging, collaborative, global presence.
That sounds very exciting, Christine. Sri Maria, I was thinking about something you said about your curatorial relationship to programming, educational programming, and trying to embed the educational components or within the curatorial fabric, I think you said. And I wonder, now that you're the director of the Stamps Gallery in a university setting, are there things that you learned from your experience in Windsor that you're bringing to your vision of the Stamps Gallery?
For sure. You know, one of the things that I perhaps didn't, you know, mention as clearly the last time too is with a project like Border Cultures, I was really interested in also, you know, really thinking about the format of exhibitions, right, or the form of an exhibition. How can an exhibition, you know, rather than an exhibition being a finite, you know, framework, how can it evolve over time? And so this notion of an exhibition in process, the exhibition as a research platform, right? So often deliberately for exhibitions, I would invite projects that are sort of not completed or fully resolved, you know, that artists are actually testing ideas out, and through the course of the show, you know, the work, you know, morphs or evolves or, you know, reconciles or resolves itself in some ways. I mean, of course, you know, the nature of the work is kind of important with that. You know, it has to be like a dynamic fit for something like that to work successfully, and then we can discuss what is success. But, you know, the notion of, you know, we took risks with the programming. So, you know, the project that I did with Wafa Bilal, 16801, where the goal was to develop, you know, there was a library at the College of Fine Art at the University of Baghdad, which was absolutely torched after the 2003 when the war started out in Iraq, and so the goal of the project was to rebuild that collection of art books. And so, you know, it was this incredible process of working with faculty at the college to get some sort of list, or to think about what can this, you know, collection of books be, you know, what could it be, given that this, you know, they had the largest collection of art books in Iraq. So the way in which we did it is we launched a Kickstarter campaign to raise funds for which we could start purchasing some books. And in exchange for that, you know, audiences and you know, folks who contributed to Kickstarter would get an artist book in exchange, right? So had the Kickstarter failed, you know, the installation would be a library of white books. Whereas, you know, thankfully we were extremely successful. From a modest goal of $7,000, we raised $59,000. And the project is now touring across Canada and hopefully in the US. You know, where we're continuing to build the collection of books. So as a result, there will, you know, we have already collected close to 20,000 books, I believe, which are now going to be shipped. And now, you know, the artist is thinking about, okay, well, because the faculty is saying, well, the library they have is not actually the right kind of, you know, is not the right kind of space. So actually, we need to rethink the building, you know, the building itself. So it's sort of spiraled into a series of projects. So so in that way, you know, that process of exchange, again, you know, the programming and the engagement is sort of critical to the piece. So the Stamps Gallery, yes, we are part of the Stamps School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan, and we're a brand new space in Ann Arbor. And really, we sort of a Kunsthal, we do not have a permanent collection. and our, a space for contemporary art and design and other projects. So we are really at the stage of, Christine, as you're mentioning, branding and rebranding. We are at the sort of test lab space, time where, we're testing everything. So absolutely, the notion of public engagement and thinking about, really bringing it back bringing it further back to what is a gallery, why a gallery, why another art cultural space and institution within the ecology of, cultural institutions that already exist in Ann Arbor and Detroit. And, in this corridor, there are so many actually fantastic spaces for art and design. And so what is, what is the Stamps Gallery here for, and what can we be? It's an incredibly exciting time, of course, but while we test out these ideas and workshop ideas, we also have the logistics of, having a program that we need to put together very quickly. So the notion of, as I said, public programs, partnerships, and collaborations are sort of at the core of what we will be doing and what we do at the Stamps Gallery, but also this idea of really, really thinking about the rhythm of exhibitions, and projects, because I think we have an incredible opportunity to really think about what is, an exhibition cycle. How many projects do we need to go through, and how can we mobilize ideas and projects? And so, and as you were saying too, Christine, the Stamps Gallery, yes, we have the brick and mortar, the space in which I'm sitting, but at the same time, I mean, the Stamps Gallery is also an idea. So the Stamps Gallery can also be at, really wherever we want it to be, if it's the program, right? And I think that was one of the key learnings from the Art Gallery of Windsor, where, I think the downfall perhaps had started once we had the rebuild, the new gallery space in 2001, I believe. And then the focus really became about the building. And then, and of course, with the support and collaboration of the director of the Art Gallery of Windsor at the time, some of the things we did was scale back on the number of exhibitions, have longer exhibitions that are more meaningful, but also really focus on the program, because that's what is bringing people in, and we'll keep bringing people in, right? Rather than to come see the space and see the big blockbuster exhibitions with which the AGW had opened. So those, so those ideas of, from the AGW are going to be, I'm hoping to expand on them, and also really think about exhibitions as research platforms, right? How, and which they are, we all know that, of course, but how can that sort of side of things also become part of not just the exhibition process, but the exhibition,
Thanks
there was
so much.
one more point that that has now escaped me.
We have a few questions coming in, so I thought I'll put a couple of questions to the panelists. Rand, there's a couple for you here. When you're saying that your program is a balance of about 15 shows a year, how many would be ticketed in-house versus incoming, large versus small?
There's probably about, I would say, well, for us, there's 3 to 4 major exhibitions a year that happen. And then there's a number of smaller shows that would happen, throughout the course of the year. Right now, just in full disclosure, Right now, if you came and you reviewed our exhibition schedule over the course of the next year or so, it's going to continue to look as though we're net importers of shows. But that's because, going back to an emphasis on the permanent collection, we're looking ahead to 2018, and we're currently planning a complete reinstallation of the permanent collection. And so, as you can imagine, that's taking an incredible amount of time and energy that the curators are focusing on that part of the business and not on those exhibitions. But on the other side of that, we're already starting to work on some projects that will allow us to ramp up the work that they're doing.
And another question is whether you're talking about your outdoor sculpture park or your park and sculpture garden when you are talking about the number of exhibition spaces within your rotation.
We don't really, I'm not sure that we look at that as being much an exhibition as much as sort of, we call it an activation. I mean, that's a big change for us. I mean, going from that blockbuster model, over the course of the past 20 months, we've really been trying to figure out how do we go from being an organization that has essentially been exhibition driven to one that's experience driven, right? That doesn't mean we're going to stop doing wonderful, compelling exhibitions, but what it does mean, as opposed to simply highlighting one primary gateway for people to connect with their museum, we're attempting to highlight multiple gateways. Over and above incredible, compelling exhibitions, our public program staff have really been, I think, laying important groundwork, both doing some pruning and improving existing programs, but at the same time also generating new programming that hopefully makes sense for our audience in key ways. And we've also really been trying to change our messaging to support all of those things. I think historically, just because Christine and Marie were talking a little bit about branding, the High, we kind of, because of those blockbuster exhibitions, we found ourselves in this really ugly sort of pursuit of one 3-month brand after another, because, okay, now everything we are is Terracotta Warriors, okay, now we're the Louvre Partnership, okay, now we're this and that. We really never focused on trying to develop our own institutional voice and character in a way that I think would create great resonance with our audience. And so we've really been focusing on that. And again, with those larger exhibitions, the other challenge with those blockbusters was that it didn't allow us to build capacity elsewhere. We were putting so much of our resources into those shows that we really weren't building up other parts of the business. And I think this new model is allowing us to be more strategic in terms of how we're growing overall.
Great. Before I move on to the next question, I just want to encourage all of you participating in the webinar to please feel free to submit questions, and we will pose them and discuss them. Have one, let's see, I think I will ask Christine this one. Any advice for increasing interest in building investment in the permanent collection that doesn't necessarily include increasing the frequency of gallery rotations?
That's a very good question. I think for us anyway, and I think curators who are on the line would probably enjoy having fun thinking through the many different stories that permanent collections can tell. And so let's just say that your gallery is somewhat static and you're not changing the objects too often. They can still be respun, let's say, messaged in different ways or multiple ways, so that your repeat visitors are coming back and finding new ways to move through the galleries, new ways to think about the artworks. Because if I think about the spaces that we have here, each of these objects tells a handful of stories at a minimum. And so there could be wonderful sort of thematic explorations that key to sort of key moments in an annual calendar, whether it's celebrations or, you know, Valentine's Day, so is there a chocolate theme, or, you know, love or something like that. If Women's History Month, and so March is a great time to sort of look at that, women artists, women themes, you know, you name it. I think if you get your curators and your programmers, your educators excited about all the stories that artworks can tell, then I think that's a strategy. And importantly, I would say if you embrace that with the mission of relevance, then I think you're going to be able to identify themes that are relevant to your diverse and changing audiences over time, to allow those objects to sing and to meet people where they are, but also to lead them, in new directions.
Great. So I have two questions for Sri-Marie that are interrelated, and I'll probably paraphrase them. The questions pertain to the level of community partnership and the labor involved in developing those kind of relationships, and a sense that they're really staff and resource intensive, the things that you're talking about, and yet it appears that you don't have a lot of additional staff resources. So I think people are looking for a bit of advice or clarity around how many extra resources are you actually needing to be developing these partnerships and this level of outreach that you're talking about.
So at the AGW, these partnerships, I was there all the time, for all the programming. So that was, definitely much more than full time. But this is where partnerships can be very gratifying and also very helpful in terms of resources. So by partnering with the School of Creative Arts at the University of Windsor, some of the programming, couple of the faculty members, they organized the panels and we would host them. One of the projects, Rena Katz, what she did is in the space that she had would transform, every month based on the partnership, the community organization that she had partnered with. So for that, obviously there were folks from the organization, and then for us, it became more about, we had figured out, in terms of the installation, what would need to be to go into place. So it was quite minimal in terms of the changes, but it was the programming which she was leading. So, it was almost like an artist in residence for that project. In terms of resources, the question is really about sustainability, right? How do we have so many ongoing programs and still not burn out, which is at the, obviously at the core, especially with shrinking budgets. Here, so those are the things that we are thinking about in terms of how do we develop, of course, since we're working at the university, we have sort of a, we have work studies and interns who get credits for their courses, which actually also in Windsor, we always had 2 or 3 interns from the University of Windsor, where, it was part of a course that they would get credits. So they would do a certain amount of hours. And so we would use, so they would be helping out during the public programming. And secondly, the partnerships become key, but again, it has to come to a point, it needs to be a collaborative partnership where, it's obviously mutually beneficial to all parties involved. And 3, it really depends on the framework of the organization. For me, with these projects, I was deeply engaged in them at every level. And, in terms of bodies, I was one of them, just being there on the ground all the time.
Okay. Thanks so much. I can see we're nearing the end of our session, and there's one question, comment and question that I think might be a great place to to sort of wrap up with, and it's a comment to Rand saying how much this person admires your perspective coming from a director. And what kind of advice would you have for curators who might want to advocate for some of the changes that we've been talking about today, refocusing, putting more time on the permanent collection instead of spending a lot of resources on blockbuster exhibitions? Do you have any advice for curators how to best advocate for themselves in making that happen?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, I think it's all about the dialogue. At the end of the day, it's kind of putting those ideas out there and hoping that they're going to catch fire with colleagues and so forth. A lot of times I think it comes down to you have to have, the stars need to align, but at the end of the day, control what you can control, right? And you're developing your own thoughts about your next exhibition or the projects that you want to work on. How will those projects dovetail with your other aspirations, your other thinking in terms of the organization, if that makes sense? I know we're running out of time, so I guess I'll end there. But it ultimately, at the end of the day, it does have to be an institutional commitment, because what you'll find is that the public programming side will do as much or more to drive attendance as your exhibitions will. They really need to go hand in hand. And then I think unless you have that balance and that symbiotic relationship, it's very difficult to really see your museum move forward in quantum leaps.
Well, I wanted to thank each of you for your insights in the last hour. I certainly picked up a few tips. I'll keep in my back pocket for the coming months. And I want to thank all of the participants for joining us. As you might know, AAMC produces about 4 webinars a year. We'll be hosting our next webinar in October, so stay tuned to the website and to Facebook for upcoming details on that. And if you go to the website under events, you'll see an archive of webinars. There's about 16 previous webinars that everyone can have access to benefit from. There's lots of really great topics there. And of course, the AAMC would love to hear from you. If there's a topic or an issue that you think would make a great webinar, you should definitely get in touch with them. So I want to say farewell and thank you again for your really great discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.